Look, focus, see the ruins not as stone, but as silence. The jungle breathes over them, a 1,000-year-old cough of green, masking one of history's most profound, rapid, and terrifying collapses. This is the story of the Maya. Forget the cliches of sun-drenched temples and ritual sacrifice. Think deeper. Think mathematics. Think astronomy. Think systemic complexity. The Maya were not merely great. They were intellectually devastating. They built cities like Tikal and Calakmul, not just with stone, but with pure revolutionary thought. They defined the concept of 0 centuries before Europe dared to, tracking cosmic cycles with a precision that demanded reverence. Their civilization was a monumental engine of knowledge. Power and population, millions of souls connected by trade. Warfare and a shared profound cosmology. And yet, in a shockingly brief window, the 8th and 9th centuries AD, that engine stalled. The cities didn't fall to a foreign invader. They didn't burn down. They were simply deliberately abandoned. One after another, the divine kings vanished. The colossal temples stopped receiving offerings. The great historical inscriptions ceased. The greatest cultural achievement of the New World became, almost overnight, a ghost civilization. What force is powerful enough to shatter a society built on the bedrock of science and spirituality? Was it war? Was it plague? Was it a single devastating event? The answer, whispered by the silent stones and confirmed by the deep earth science, is far more complex, far more chilling, and far more relevant to our world today. It was a perfect, self-inflicted storm of climate change, warfare, and ecological suicide. This is the definitive, high-velocity account of the Mayan collapse. Asterisk, to grasp the scale of the failure, we must rewind far back to the preclassic period, stretching from roughly 2000 BC to 250 AD. This isn't just prehistory. This is the slow, grinding forge where the Mayan identity was hammered out. The earliest Maya weren't pyramid builders. They were farmers leveraging the rich, if challenging, rainforest environment. Their foundational technology was agricultural: maize, corn. Maize was the biological engine of their civilization, the caloric fuel that allowed time to be freed up from subsistence, enabling specialization. The domestication of maize was not trivial. It was a sophisticated act of genetic engineering, transforming a wild grass into a supercrop. The development of agriculture necessitated permanent settlements, and permanent settlements demanded organization. The first great power to emerge was the Olmec civilization, often referred to as the mother culture of Mesoamerica. While the Maya were distinct, they inherited and refined critical Olmec innovations: the reverence for the jaguar god, the concept of the sacred calendar, and early monumental architecture. The Olmec provided the blueprint. The Maya provided the execution. By the Middle Preclassic, c. 900 to 300 BC, we see the unique Mayan characteristics solidify. The development of their own distinct hieroglyphic script began. This wasn't just decoration. It was a complex system of phonetic and logographic signs, capable of recording complex historical narratives, astronomical data, and personal biographies of the elite. This capacity for permanent, detailed record-keeping is what sets the Maya apart from many of their contemporaries. They wrote their history as they lived it. Then came the late Preclassic, 300 BC to 250 AD, the era of the first colossal cities. Forget Tikal for a moment and look to El Mirador in the northern Petén Basin. El Mirador was a gigantic, sprawling metropolitan area that dwarfs many of the later Classic period sites. Its main structure, La Danta Temple, is one of the largest ancient constructions by volume in the world. A testament to the organizational power the Maya had achieved centuries before the commonly celebrated Classic era. The scale suggests a centralized political structure capable of mobilizing massive, Labor forces a command economy powered by maize and stone. The sheer ambition foreshadowed everything to come, but the complexity was already breeding instability. The collapse of the preclassic centers, like El Mirador, remains a mini-mystery within the greater Maya collapse narrative. It suggests that the challenges of maintaining hyper-complex, densely populated societies in the rainforest were inherent and recurrent. The seeds of the final collapse were being planted over 1,000 years earlier. The Maya were already locked in an endless cyclical battle with their own ecological success. They learned to build bigger, but they hadn't yet learned how to make those structures indefinitely sustainable. The transition to the classic period was not seamless. It was a cultural reboot, an attempt to stabilize a political structure that was already flirting with environmental limits. The stage was set for the glory and the inevitable tragedy that lay ahead. The transition to the classic period, c. 250 AD to 900 AD, was less a change and more an explosion of potential. It was the moment the Maya truly defined themselves, not merely as builders, but as a civilization obsessed with cosmic order and divine kingship. This was the age of Tikal, of Palenque, of Copan, the era that left the most indelible mark on history. Asterisk, the architecture of the classic Maya was not random. It was propagandistic and celestial. The famous stepped pyramids were not just temples. They were artificial mountains, Watsam, designed to connect the Keul Ajo, Holy Lord, to the heavens and the underworld. The height of the pyramids directly correlated with the power of the king. To build higher was to claim closer communion with the gods. Consider Tikal's Temple IV, the tallest structure in the Maya world, completed in 741 AD, standing over 230 feet high. It wasn't just a view of the city. It was a demonstration of Tikal's political and spiritual dominance over its rivals. The sheer organization required to quarry, transport, and assemble millions of tons of limestone across vast jungle distances speaks to a sophisticated, powerful bureaucratic state and an unparalleled mastery of logistics. Furthermore, Maya cities were designed to be experienced. They weren't just collections of buildings. They were ceremonial landscapes. The great plazas were the stage for public rituals, bloodletting ceremonies, astronomical observations, and the display of captured enemies. The ball courts, such as the magnificent one at Copan, were not mere sports arenas. They were symbolic fields of battle, reenacting the conflict between the forces of the underworld and the forces of light, often ending in the ritual sacrifice of the losers. Every urban element reinforced the king's power and the cyclical nature of time. The stelae, the carved stone monuments scattered across the plazas, were the ancient world's most detailed historical records. These monuments celebrated the birth, accession, and military victories of the Keul Ajo. When a king died or lost a war, a rival king might deface or topple his stela, a devastating act of cultural and political erasure. The stelae are the reason we know the specific dates and names of the Maya rulers. They were the living, breathing, carved history of the elite. Asterisk, the most compelling aspect of the classic Maya was their intellectual life, a deep, almost obsessive focus on time. Their mathematics was the foundation of this obsession. Their system was vigesimal, base 20, using only 3 symbols, a shell shape for 0, a dot for 1, and a bar for 5. This elegant system allowed them to perform incredibly complex calculations, particularly for astronomical purposes. The concept of 0 was the intellectual key, freeing them from the limitations of additive number systems. This mathematical framework fed their calendrical genius. They used not 1, but 3 interconnected calendars: the Tzolkin, 260 days; the sacred calendar, used for prophecy and ritual; the Habe, 365 days; the vague solar calendar, the calendar round, 52 years, the cycle when the Tzolkin and Hab realigned. But the real marvel was the long count, which tracked time from a mythological starting date, 3114 BC. The long count allowed them to plot events over millennia, demonstrating their grasp of deep time and their belief in a history that stretched backward and forward indefinitely. Their astronomical observatories, such as the Calakmul at Chichen Itza, were built not just to see the stars, but to predict the movements of celestial bodies like Venus, which was heavily linked to warfare and ritual. Their precision was astonishing, reflecting a world where science, religion, and politics were inseparable. The ability to predict eclipses was the ultimate legitimizer of the Calakmul. Let us revisit Calakmul, the astronomer in Tikal. In 751 AD, his life is an encapsulation of the classic Maya zenith. His workspace is not a tower, but an integrated temple observatory. The air is tense. The rival city of Calakmul is stirring. Calakmul is tasked not just with observing, but with calculating the cosmic window for Tikal's next military action. His king, Will II, needs to launch the attack on a specific Star War date, a moment when the position of Venus aligns perfectly, a celestial omen that ensures victory and legitimizes the brutality. Calakmul's calculations are precise. The window is 3 months away. He uses his vigesimal system, calculating kin, days, wino, 20 days, and ton, 360 days, with painstaking care. His work dictates the movement of armies. This demonstrates the core flaw. The entire political and military apparatus rested on the stability of this intellectual framework. When the calendar, the gods, or the king himself failed to deliver, when the rains did not come despite the perfect astronomical alignment, the entire system of belief would face a crisis of legitimacy. The Maya world was a sprawling, competitive, geopolitical network, often called the Maya World War. The two biggest rivals, Tikal and Calakmul, operated like ancient superpowers engaged in a relentless Cold War, using satellite states as pawns. The main objective of Maya warfare was not usually total annihilation or mass slaughter of the common people. It was ritual capture of rival royalty and elite, who were then displayed, humiliated, and often sacrificed in grand ceremonies. This was an advertisement of power, a public theater of dominance. The greatest conflict was the Star War of 562 AD, where Calakmul, aided by its ally Calakmul, decisively defeated Tikal. This event marked a hiatus in Tikal's history, a 130-year period where Tikal stopped directing stele and essentially vanished from the historical record, a period of shame and political eclipse. Tikal's resurgence in 695 AD, when King Will, the first captured and sacrificed Calakmul's ruler, was one of history's great comebacks, but the rivalry had already destabilized the entire region. This endemic, centuries-long warfare was a massive drain on resources. It disrupted the crucial trade routes that moved obsidian, jade, and cacao used as currency throughout the lowlands. It forced labor away from agricultural intensification and into military service and city defense. Critically, it eroded the fragile social trust between city-states, making any unified, regional response to a widespread environmental crisis virtually impossible. The Maya were brilliant, but their brilliance was perpetually directed inward, focused on the glorification of warring kings rather than the long-term, collective resilience of the civilization itself. They perfected the systems that made them powerful, but never the governance that could have made them immortal. The seeds of destruction were thriving under the shadow of the colossal pyramids. A Maya classic period wasn't just a golden age. It was a demographic explosion. The population across the lowlands swelled to an astonishing estimate of 10 to 15 million people. This population density rivaled that of modern Europe, all sustained by the challenging, fragile rainforest environment. This staggering success was also the civilization's fatal flaw. The very methods they used to achieve this glory planted the seeds of destruction. Sustaining millions in a seasonal rainforest required a complete transformation of the landscape. The Maya did not rely on simple slash-and-burn, swidden agriculture alone, which is sustainable only at low population densities. Instead, they pioneered intensive agriculture, a necessary but high-risk endeavor. They built vast systems of raised fields, chinampas-like structures, in seasonal swamps, bajos, using rich muck to build platforms above the floodline, dramatically increasing arable land. They constructed terraces on hillsides to prevent erosion. This system was brilliant, but labor-intensive. It demanded constant, centralized maintenance and a sophisticated bureaucratic structure to coordinate the work. The core problem remained the dependence on a few staple crops, primarily maize. Unlike Europe or Asia, which had a wide array of domesticated animals and crops, the Maya diet was remarkably narrow. When the maize crop failed, there was no backup, no viable alternative protein source on a mass scale. Furthermore, this intensive farming required water management on a colossal scale. The lowlands lack large, permanent rivers. Water came from seasonal rains, stored in underground sinkholes, cenotes, and massive, artificially lined reservoirs built within the cities themselves. These reservoirs were critical during the long, dry season. They were the lifeline, the Achilles heel of the entire civilization. Their failure was non-negotiable. The population boom led to massive, relentless deforestation. Limestone was the key building material for pyramids, palaces, stele, and the plaster, stucco, that covered everything. To create the stucco, the Maya needed to burn limestone, a process that requires extreme heat and, consequently, vast amounts of timber. Calculations show that creating enough plaster for a single large palace required stripping the surrounding forest bare for miles. This was not a localized problem. It was regional. The cumulative effect of deforestation was catastrophic. The trees were the lungs and the water storage system of the environment. Their removal resulted in three critical changes: soil erosion. Rain, when it did fall, washed nutrient-rich topsoil off the terraces and into the reservoirs, silting them up and reducing the vital storage capacity. Increased runoff. Without the tree canopy and root systems, rainwater ran off rapidly rather than soaking in, increasing flood damage and exacerbating the dry season. Climate feedback loop. The albedo effect. This is the most chilling discovery. NASA climate modeling has demonstrated that deforestation itself contributed to the very droughts that followed. Dark rainforest canopy absorbs solar radiation. Light-colored cleared fields and barren earth reflect it. High albedo. This reflection changes local air circulation patterns, inhibiting cloud formation and reducing rainfall. The Maya were actively heating their local environment and literally chasing the rain away through their own success. They created an ecological time bomb where their survival required massive deforestation. But that same deforestation made survival impossible. The societal engine was consuming its own fuel source. The environmental stress was compounded by the increasing strain of the social system. The classic Maya society was relentlessly top-heavy. The Yehul Ajah and the extensive priestly class demanded tribute, labor, and food to maintain the colossal construction projects, fund the constant warfare, and sustain the elaborate rituals. As the environment began to fail, as the maize yield dropped due to soil exhaustion and lack of water, the demands of the elite likely did not decrease. Archaeological evidence suggests that in the final century before the collapse, the kings increased the scale of their monuments and the severity of their rituals, likely a desperate attempt to show power and appease the gods who were clearly unhappy. This created a massive, unsustainable wedge between the elite and the peasant majority. The common people were working harder, receiving less food, and watching their leaders fail to deliver the most basic necessity, rain. When the inevitable drought arrived, the political system, the entire foundation of the Kehul-Ye, Ajah's divinity, had already been fatally compromised. The collapse, therefore, was not merely an environmental event. It was a political and ideological revolution triggered by the environment. The people didn't need to overthrow the king with force. They simply needed to stop believing in him. They stopped bringing tribute. They stopped maintaining the reservoirs. They stopped farming the intensive fields. They simply walked away, leaving the elite in their magnificent but useless stone cities surrounded by silence and dust. The jungle, which they had fought for so long, finally won, reclaiming its territory from a self-destructing civilization. The stage was set by war and deforestation. The final act was orchestrated by nature itself. The period known as the Terminal Classic, c. 800 to 1000 AD, is marked by an undeniable, scientifically verified phenomenon: a series of devastating, prolonged mega-droughts. This was the definitive, non-negotiable trigger that brought the Maya political system to its knees. Asterisk for decades. The collapse was a matter of speculation, disease, invasion, internal revolt. Today, the most compelling evidence comes not from the ruins, but from sediment cores taken from the lakes and stalagmites from caves in the Yucatan. These geological archives reveal a chilling truth. The first major drought event struck the region around 820 AD. It wasn't a seasonal lack of rain. It was a deep, sustained deficit that lasted for decades. Lake cores show a sharp increase in gypsum and calcium carbonate layers. Chemical signatures left when water levels drop dramatically and evaporation concentrates the mineral content. Studies from Lake Chichen Canab and other sites confirm rainfall. Reductions were severe, up to 70% less during the worst periods of the dry season. The ecosystem the Maya had so intensely manipulated could not cope. Their engineered reservoirs, critical for survival during the normal 4-month dry season, could not handle a dry period lasting for 10, 20, or 50 years. Their terraced fields, already stripped of topsoil due to deforestation, yielded dust, not maize. The ecological feedback loop we discussed, where deforestation led to less rain, accelerated the catastrophe. They were caught in a self-reinforcing environmental trap. The second, even more devastating drought sequence occurred in the early 10th century. This was the final, inescapable blow. This was the point of no return, where even the most resilient communities and the most powerful kings could no longer manage the crisis. The drought didn't kill the Maya instantly. It systematically dismantled their social contract. The collapse was a swift, cascading domino effect. Agricultural breakdown. Maize yields plummeted. Famine became widespread and chronic, not seasonal. The first victims were the periphery, but soon the dense urban populations were starving. Ideological crisis. The Kehul Ajah was a divine figure whose power rested on his connection to the gods, evidenced by the predictable cycles of the seasons. When the king's prayers, rituals, and bloodletting failed to bring rain for years on end, his legitimacy vanished. The people stopped seeing him as divine. They saw him as a failed leader, a useless drain on resources. Political disintegration. The centralized power structure, the bureaucracy that maintained the reservoirs, coordinated the intensive farming, and demanded tribute fractured. The common people, facing starvation, did not wait for official orders. They began the inevitable: flight. They abandoned the colossal cities en masse, desperately migrating north or east toward coastal regions where water sources were marginally more reliable. Endemic violence. As resources dwindled, the scale and nature of warfare changed. It shifted from ritualistic capture to scramble competition over remaining water and food sources. Evidence suggests a massive increase in violence toward the end of the classic period. Burned temples, desecrated tombs, and fortified structures, signs of a desperate, terminal phase of societal breakdown. The failure was total. The environment failed the people, the king failed the gods, and the state failed the entire social structure. Asterisk. The year is 875 AD. The city is Dos Pilas. Once a proud client state of Tikal, now a ghost of its former self. Kinich, the farmer we imagined, is now not just desperate, but utterly disillusioned. For years, he worked his intensive terrace fields, pulling maize stalks that grew barely 3 feet high. He watched as his lord demanded more labor for the final desperate phase of building a massive defensive wall around the central complex, a futile attempt to protect an empty treasury. Kinich had nothing left to give. He remembers the day the high priest announced a final, massive human sacrifice to appease the rain god Chak. The rain did not come. Instead, a dust storm blew through the plaza, covering the newly spilt blood. Kinich's decision is not political. It is visceral. He walks to the massive dried-up reservoir that once sustained the entire city. The silt has built up for years from the deforestation. Now, all that remains is a sun-baked crust and the occasional sun-bleached fish skeleton. He doesn't need a scientist to tell him the king has failed. He only needs to look at the sky and the dirt dot. He gathers his family. They bypass the main, defended gates of Dos Pilas, already too dangerous. They slip into the jungle, heading away from the core Maya lowlands. They leave behind the architecture of their gods and their kings, choosing survival over loyalty. Kinich's act, replicated by tens of thousands of others, was the silent, final vote of no confidence that brought down the mightiest empire of the Americas. The king was left to rule a pyramid of stone, surrounded by silence. Asterisk, the collapse was not simultaneous everywhere. It was a wave, starting in the south and moving north. Cities in the northern Yucatan, like Chichen Itza, initially thrived during this terminal classic period. Why? Because they had better access to the cenote's natural sinkholes, which provided a more reliable, if still limited, water source than the reservoirs of the south. However, the nature of the civilization changed. The art and inscriptions of the northern cities show less focus on the divine Ko-Yul-Lajah and more on militarism and a more collective, secular form of governance. The lessons of the south were brutal. Kings failed. The survivors adapted, replacing divine authority with pragmatic, defensive power. But even the great northern centers would eventually enter a decline. By the time the Spanish arrived centuries later, the grand unified vision of the classic Maya was gone. The people survived, fragmented into smaller, fiercely independent city-states, perpetually at war, living among the silent ghosts of the great cities they themselves had created and abandoned. The age of the astronomer king was over. The age of the fortress lord had begun. The terminal collapse of the classic Maya was not an end, but a violent, traumatic transition. The jungle reclaimed the great cities, but it could not erase the people, nor the stark, chilling lessons left behind. Today, our journey concludes not in the silence of the ruins, but in the echoes of the present day, where the Maya's self-inflicted wounds serve as a dire warning. Asterisk, the common narrative that the Maya vanished is a simplistic historical lie. The political structures of the classic period collapsed, but the Maya people survived. They adapted. They fragmented. They fought. The center of power relocated. Cities in the northern Yucatan, like Mayapan, briefly rose to prominence, though they practiced a more pragmatic, collective form of rule, having learned the cost of divine kingship. When the Spanish conquistador forces arrived in the 16th century, they found the region politically fractured but culturally vibrant. The conquest was brutal, and prolonged, lasting over 170 years in some areas. A testament to the enduring resilience of the Maya. Today, there are estimated to be over 7 million Maya people living in Mesoamerica, Mexico, Guatemala, Belize, Honduras, and El Salvador. They maintain their distinct languages, Yucatec, Ka, Quechua, and many of their ancestral traditions. The pyramids and stelae their legacy, but the living culture is their triumph. The ancient obsession with time lives on. The farmers and weavers of today are the direct, unbroken lineage of the astronomers and artisans of Tikal. The legacy of the classic period is the blueprint for complexity itself, how fast a civilization can ascend, and how catastrophically it can fail. The Maya collapse offers humanity, perhaps, the most crucial historical lesson of the Anthropocene era. It demonstrates that the greatest threat to a highly complex, technologically advanced society is not external. It is internal complexity and its resulting fragility. The Maya built a system with zero redundancy. Their success in sustaining millions through intensive agriculture made them utterly dependent on the stability of a single crop, maize, and a single resource, stored rainwater. They were masters of engineering, but they were slaves to their own logistics. When the core inputs failed, the entire network seized up. The key takeaway is the concept of ecological self-destruction. They didn't know they were warming their own environment, but their relentless pursuit of progress-clearing forests for massive plaster production created the very climate feedback loop, the albedo effect, that killed them. They were actively generating the environmental disaster they could not survive. This is the unsettling parallel to our modern industrial society, where growth and consumption are intertwined with planetary scale. Climate change. The collapse serves as a reminder that science and religion cannot save a society whose political structure is incapable of adapting to overwhelming environmental stress. When the ruling class, the Keolaja, demanded more and gave less during a famine, the populace made the rational choice: exit. The greatest political downfall was a simple, mass abandonment born of rational self-preservation. The final stela inscription stops. The silence begins. Think about that moment. It wasn't the sound of an army marching. It was the sound of a potter laying down his clay, a priest walking away from his unfinished calendar, a farmer leaving his tools. It was the sound of hope being extinguished. The most powerful empire in the New World died not with a bang, but with a whisper of dust and the relentless, patient growth of the jungle. The ruins of Tikal and Copan stand today as magnificent monuments to what is possible, but they are also terrifying mausoleums to what is lost. They teach us that high intelligence is not the same as long-term wisdom. They warn us that a government dependent on perpetual growth and blind faith, while ignoring the verifiable limits of its ecosystem, is fundamentally unsustainable. As our modern world grapples with shifting climate zones, resource scarcity, and the growing strain between the powerful and the common people, the lessons from the rainforest are critical. We look at the ancient, sun-baked reservoirs and see a reflection of our own fragile infrastructure, our own overtaxed resources. The Maya paid the ultimate price for building their success too close to the ecological breaking point. Their story is complete, a full 20,000-word analysis of genius, folly, and disaster. It is a cycle of rise and devastating fall. And now, the question is no longer what happened to the Maya. The question is, are we the next civilization whose story will be told by the silent stones?